Hello! In this video, we're going to be discussing ancient art history and the origins of art. And we're going to start by looking at this image right here. This is called the Woman of Willendorf. It used to be called the Venus of Willendorf, but there's not really any reason for this to be a Venus figure because it predates any real known recorded religion that we have. A lot of textbooks and in all of my studies, this is always presented as the oldest work of art. It's not. It's not the oldest work of art, but it is very old. And we don't really know exactly what the purpose of this was. We do know that there were a lot of these made. They were like stone statuettes that you could hold and carry with you. Sometimes they would have a hole that you could put them on a necklace or keep them in a pocket. Not that they had pockets. But one of the things that we note about this is that it is the figure of a woman, and she is rather large. And whenever we're looking at ancient history, we have to remember that people did not have access to super high caloric foods. Today in America, most of us have some kind of food security. We more or less know where our next meal is going to come from. And a lot of the foods that we eat have a lot of calories in them. This is a time that would not be the case. If you're hunting for food or gathering food, berries and roots, to have a larger figure would be very difficult. So this is often associated with some kind of fertility, maybe pregnancy and wealth, that this would be a goal to look like this. If you look like this, then you have access to food. You have access even to wealth. So what we have here, this is a figure of a woman. This here is her arms that are engaged to the body. Engaged meaning they're attached. It's still very much rock formed. You don't have anything moving away from the body. You don't have the arms moving away. The legs do separate a little bit at the bottom. And she doesn't have a face. What we see here, this is braided hair at the top. Again, we don't exactly know what the use of this was. If it had some kind of spiritual significance, if it was for good luck, to bring good fortune, if it was something that someone wishing to get pregnant might hire an artist or an artisan to create this for you to have with you as a talisman. These are all guesses because it's something it could have been used for. It could have just been a decoration. We don't exactly know the purpose. But like I said before, this is not actually the oldest art that we have. If we want to look for the oldest art ever to be made, we need to look at where humans come from. Because for some reason, as humans, we have this innate desire to create things. Humans make art. Humans like designing things. It's just a part of being human. So when we look at where humans come from, we're talking about Africa. Where in Africa, we don't exactly know. Oftentimes people say it's probably Botswana or somewhere in the southern part of Africa, which would be down here. But some of that has to do with how artifacts are found. When you look at areas like this green, this rainforest that comes in here, this is the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is tropical rainforest. If something is 100,000 years old, for us to find it, it has to be preserved for 100,000 years. And in a tropical rainforest, nothing is going to last that long. Nothing. Rocks won't even last that long because there is so much vegetation, there is so much moisture, there's a lot of rain, there is humidity, and so everything after a certain amount of time is going to be taken over by plants and destroyed. So artifacts that old have to be from somewhere that they can be preserved, which is where we start to get, as we get farther away from the equator and farther away from the tropics, we start to get into these areas that are more deserty, the grasslands, semi-arid, and really the desert. So our oldest evidence for humans' existence right now comes from right here, which is, the desert that's closest to the center of Africa. So we do have artifacts that are found here, and in South Africa, and then other artifacts found up in Egypt, and this is the Sahara Desert. Things are going to be more preserved in the desert because there's no moisture, it's very dry, things tend to last there longer. So a lot of what we'll look at today either comes from an area that is somewhat arid, is desert, or coming from a cave, because caves also preserve things. So the first thing that we're going to look at today is this, which is more likely the oldest artwork that we know of, the oldest surviving artwork in the world. This is a stone that has been carved into in a cave called Blombos Cave in South Africa. And when we talk about caves and artwork found in caves, your mind tends to go towards cave people. And our ideas of cave people are like these very like rough, kind of animal-like people. And that's just kind of a stereotype that's happened over time with cartoons and people's, just because we find all of this stuff in caves. The reason a lot of this artwork, this early artwork and artifacts come from caves isn't because people were just cave dwellers and didn't go outside. It's because caves preserve things. Caves provide shelter from the sun, shelter from animals, shelter from rain. Caves are a really good place to preserve artifacts. So when we talk about like, oh, the earliest artwork is found in caves, they were also making artwork outside. They didn't only make artwork in caves. They also went outside and enjoyed the nice weather. They didn't stay in the caves all the time. This is just stuff that was preserved, and the cave preserved it. So this is an interesting artifact as the earliest known artwork because it's very abstract. It is the simplest shapes. It's just lines on a rock, triangles that are put together into a pattern, clearly intentional, that ends up making these hexagon shapes. It's our simplest element of design is line, and then shape, and the simplest shape being a three-sided shape, a triangle. So the beginning of design here. Again, we don't know what the purpose of this was. Did it have a purpose, or is this just art? Is this just art for art's sake? We don't know if this was made by someone performing a ritual or some kind of spiritual practice, or if this was some 6-year-old kid that rubbed two rocks together and was like, hey, I can scratch one rock with the other rock that's harder, and then just made these triangles, and it was fun. Because that is just something that kids do. I could definitely see my son making something like this on the sidewalk with a stick. It gives me that vibe. All right, so going out of Africa, we don't have a lot of artifacts from that southern tip of Africa. We don't have a lot of examples, not yet. I suspect that over the next couple of decades, there will be a lot more of those artifacts coming out of South Africa. And hopefully there will be more excavations in Botswana to see if we can find something even older. So now we are going to move to Europe. This is in Spain, a cave in Santander in Spain. And these are some of our earliest drawings, cave drawings. The pigments in these, the color, comes from earth. This is red earth, red dirt. There's yellow earth in here, different colors of mud. And the black comes from charcoal from sticks that have been heated up with a lack of oxygen to make them into carbon. And these drawings are of bulls. And Spain is very famous for their bulls. Even today, they have a long-standing tradition of the running of the bulls, and there is something sacred about bulls. So what is it about people that made them want to just like start drawing bulls all over the place? Well, bulls and cows are a very good source of food. And so if there's a herd of buffalo, you want to follow that herd. if you can kill one buffalo, you have food for at least a week, longer. You can dry it out. You can feed your whole family for quite a while with one of these animals. So they became associated with wealth and prosperity and security, food security, safety. And even today in some places, cows and bulls are kind of sacred. I lived in Rwanda for 2 years, and the culture surrounding cows in Rwanda is very positive. That people have dances that they do, that they have their arms resemble the horns of a cow dance. It's a compliment to tell someone there, like, oh, you walk slow like a cow. That's a compliment. And there's something sacred about a cow because it is this life-bringing animal. It can sustain you. In this cave, there's drawings that are very far apart from each other. So some of these drawings are much older than others, where you have generation after generation of people drawing on this same wall. So you might have 2 drawings on this same wall that are over 100 years apart. So dating this is very strange because this wall has been used over and over for this purpose. Another cave I want to talk about is this one here. This is Cueva de las Manos in Argentina. And this one has a little bit of a different style. You look at these hands, it's Cueva de las Manos, which is the cave of the hands, which, makes sense. And when you look at this, you can tell that these aren't drawn on there like the buffalo were in the last cave. That these are made in a different way, that these are handprints on the wall. So the way that these were made is that they would take whatever their pigment is. A pigment is a ground up powder that gives you color. So this would be just like dirt or soot or something. So with this, you have the white that is like a chalk substance, and then the brown, which is earth, it's dirt, and then the black again is charcoal. And you would they would put it in their mouth, mix it with saliva, and with a straw, they would put their hand on the cave wall and spray it, almost like spray paint, and it would make that imprint of the hand. So in a way, this is the earliest example that we have of what would now be called street art. This is essentially taking spray paint, putting your hand on the wall and spraying around it. It also ends up being our earliest example of some kind of printmaking. So printmaking as an art is when you have one object and you use it to make an imprint on another object, kind of like stamping. So we have this early example of art forms that would emerge much later on. And when you look at this, you find all different kinds of hands. There are children's hands in here, men's hands, women's hands, all different sizes and shapes of hands, meaning this wasn't just one person doing this. It was probably one person that discovered this as a technique and was like, this is so cool, and showed their friends. Again, I always think it's children. For some reason, I feel like kids always discover these things. For some reason, I feel like it was just some bored kid like put dirt in his mouth and spit, and it made the shape of his hand. He's like, this is cool. And he told his friends, and they told their parents. And the next thing you know, the whole community is there putting their handprints on the wall. And here we are, tens of thousands of years later, enjoying it. All right, so I want to give you a reference for what we are going to look at next and for the rest of this video, which is art of the Middle East and Egypt. So when we talk about the cradle of civilization, what's called the cradle of civilization, it's also called the Fertile Crescent. It's this area in Iraq, Syria, going up into Turkey that was very fertile. There was 2 river systems that surrounded it, and that area just had a lot of greenery. There was a lot to eat there. It was a place of security. And one of the first places that people settled into communities, and so you started to have things being built. This move away from traveling with wild herds of buffalo to agriculture and farming and keeping livestock so that you don't have to move to find a food source. So we are going to be talking about, starting out, we're talking about Iraq, this area in blue in the middle. These are the statues. The statue, it's called the Horde from Tel Asmar, which is in Iraq. So Tel is a word that means a hill. It's a kind of hill. So a tell is where a hill has been built over time by communities of people. So when you'd have these main trade routes where maybe there's a river going through and two rivers converge. So for travelers and for people moving goods and for food, that's a very important point on a journey. Whoever owns that community makes all of the money through trade and kind of controls the flow of trade and controls the power in the region. So there would be these specific locations that people wanted to claim as theirs. And what would happen is one community would live there, they would have their homes, it's where they would have their communities and their families. And then another group would say, I want this land, and they would come in and go to war with them, conquer them, kill everyone. The common practice was mass androcide, which would be killing all of the men and then taking the women and sometimes children as property. And when they would do that, they would completely destroy the town. They would destroy all the homes, burn them down, destroy any evidence of the community that lived there before, and bury it, and then build a new town on top of it. And they would enjoy their new town that they built, their new city, until another group that was more powerful would come in, commit androcide, once again, killing the men, desolate the community, destroy all the homes, burn it down, bury it, build a new community on top of it. And this would happen over and over and over. And eventually what would happen is what was flat ground becomes a hill, where it has all of these layers of different communities, different cultures buried under it. For archaeologists, this is exciting, but it's also confusing. So archaeologists that are digging it out to try to find artifacts, the top of the hill, what they're digging out first, is the newest. The stuff that they really are interested in finding is at the bottom of the hill, because that's the oldest stuff there is. That's the oldest community, the first community that was there. That's the artifacts they want to get to, but they have to excavate one layer at a time. So often they're tearing down to this layer, trying to rebuild it in another location, tearing down some more, rebuilding that community in another location. Sometimes they'll find an artifact and they're like, this artifact seems out of place with the other artifacts. And then later realizing, oh, that comes from an earlier community. So when this community came in and conquered that community, someone must have taken this artifact, this bowl or this pot or something, and used it. But it's actually from an older time, from the same site. So this collection of statues came from Tel Asmar, one of these tells. And these are in incredibly good shape. These are family statues. There's a lot of names for them. Like ancestral figures is most commonly what they're referred to. Sometimes you'll hear them referred to as idols, but I'm going to use the term ancestral figures. So these would be important ancestors, important family members who passed away, and you had these statues of them. Sometimes these could be life-size, sometimes they would be very small, that you could travel with them and you take them with you. It's hard to know how much people actually felt that these contained any kind of spirit or essence of an ancestor. And how much they're just a representation of that ancestor, so that that ancestor is not forgotten. And it seems kind of weird for us to be like, oh, this is my statue of my deceased grandfather. But I have a picture of my grandfather that I keep on the wall that after he passed away, I still have his picture. I have it up in my house. I have some things that he gave to me and some things that were his that I now keep, and they're mine now, like some wooden trucks that he gave me as a child. And he had a statue of a bear that when he passed away, I inherited. And I care a lot about those things because they remind me of him. When I see them, I think about him. And so his memory isn't forgotten because I kind of have these tokens of appreciation of my grandfather. These would be similar to that we don't think it's that weird to have a picture of a loved one who passed away. We don't usually have statues of them. But this was the common practice, to have a statue of a loved one. Now, you might have noticed that a couple of these have eyeballs that are rather large. Some of them had eyeballs that are really big. Like, this is weird, right? I don't think that Grandma looked like this. This is clearly an exaggerated feature. There's been a lot of history about people when they pass on. Their physical eyes are closed and their spiritual eyes are open. They actually see more than before. Sometimes ancestors are used as a way of adding some kind of moral obligation to young people. So this would be like if a grandparent has passed away and you have this is the statue of that grandparent. You kind of get that idea that Grandma is watching, that she sees you. She sees everything. She's not going to miss a single thing. And in some cultures, you had this idea that a family could have an assigned ancestral spirit that is responsible for protecting that family in a spiritual way, in the other realm. They advocate for and protect the living people that are still here. So you do have that concept of, well, you need to be really nice to your elders. You need to be really nice to your grandparents because you don't know. They might be your protecting spirit. When you grow up, when you have your own family, the spirit over your family might be your grandmother, and you need to be aware of how you're treating her right now. So these big eyes kind of represent that, like, all-seeing, almost deified, but not quite godlike. It's just that grandma's presence is very much still there. Personally, I would not want this staring at me all day. It is a little bit much, but that is what's going on there. I do want to point out on this that what we do see a little bit of an advancement in the way these are carved. You see a little bit of that space between the elbow and the body that goes through. The arms are not quite as engaged. They're semi-engaged. They're starting to come away from the body. They're starting to be their own appendages. But again, when you start to separate those arms from the body, it becomes a more advanced sculpture, but it also becomes more fragile. So you start to see sculptures with an arm missing or with legs missing. You can see some of these don't have legs. The ones that have legs, the legs were attached to a piece of stone in the back that made them stronger. The ones that had free-standing individual legs, those legs did not survive. They're gone. So it's likely that these figures on the left had legs and that the legs were disengaged, that they were freestanding, and that's why they are no longer attached. All right. Also in Iraq, we now are talking about a place called Babylon. This was the gate to Babylon. This is called Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate. So Babylon was an area of extreme wealth. This was a city that was very powerful in the region, and they had a lot of riches. This gate is made out of lapis. That blue that you see, those are blue stone tiles, lapis lazuli. Lapis is also called ultramarine. When we talk about the color ultramarine, the origins of that name is because of this stone. This is a semi-precious stone. You see it a lot of in neoclassical art, in Egyptian art as well. We could not build this today. It would be very, very difficult to get that much lapis. It's a lot of lapis and very large tiles of lapis. So lapis, the reason we call it ultramarine now, in English, why we call it ultramarine, is because this stone is found in the Middle East. The number one place to find it today is Afghanistan. And so when it went to Europe, whenever this stone ended up in Europe, it had to travel over the Mediterranean Sea in a ship to get to Europe. And so they called it ultramarine, meaning oversea. It's oversea blue, ultramarine blue. It's the stone lapis. This is a huge gate. And what you see on the right there is a little piece of the wall that went around the city. This is a massive amount of wealth and power in the region. So today, if you wanted to see this, it's not in Iraq. This museum that we're looking at right now, this is in Germany. So how does the Ishtar Gate end up in Germany? Well, the excavation of Babylon, when this was uncovered, was done by Germans. And if you've ever heard the term finders keepers, that term, I don't know if it originated with archaeologists, but was very popular with archaeologists in the early 1900s. That archaeologists from Europe would get funding for these expeditions, that they would go to the Middle East, they would go to Egypt, they would uncover things like this, and then bring them back to their own country. So this was uncovered by Germans, who then brought it back to Germany and rebuilt it in this museum. Now, the country of Iraq would like it back. They say, this is our history. This is our monument. You can't just take it because you had the money to excavate it. This is theft and it needs to come back. So there's always this argument between the Iraqi government and this museum, because the museum does not want to let it go. The museum knows its worth, and they're like, oh, well, how much will you pay for it? And they're like, well, we shouldn't have to pay for our own artifact. So there's ongoing legal battles about this, and many of the artwork that we'll look at have the same kind of legal battle where the artwork was stolen from its country of origin. So still in Iraq, this is in a place called this is a ziggurat. A ziggurat, it just means a high place that you would go up to be higher. These were places of spiritual significance, part of a spiritual practice. And this is only part of the building. The top of it has been torn down. A lot of artwork in the Middle East, a lot of artwork in Iraq has been destroyed due to something called iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is when you purposefully destroy significant artifacts and culturally relevant items from another community. So it was common for a person of one religious background to go in, and when they conquer an area, to destroy any evidence of the religion and culture that was there before. So this was a much taller building. It didn't just fall down. It was torn down by people who did not believe in the religious practice that was practiced there before. So this should be taller. It had lots of levels to it. Now, does this remind you of anything? It looks like a similar shape that we've seen other places that we're familiar with. It looks similar to something like this. So this is in Chichen Itza. This is in Mexico. Or this structure. It doesn't exactly look the same, but it has a similar shape. This is Monk's Mound in Cahokia, Illinois. This is about 20 minutes from my house, and the largest mound in the United States, made by the Native Americans here. Which also reminds us of these, the greatest pyramids in the world, the pyramids at Giza. Why does this shape show up all over the world? We have pyramids in Africa. This is in the Americas. This is also in the Americas. This is in Mexico. And this is in Iraq. There are pyramid shapes in India and in China and all over the world. This shape shows up. Why? Why does everyone make this shape? Well, there's a lot of theories. If anyone's ever seen like Ancient Aliens, then they'll say, well, clearly it's because of aliens. Clearly there's something else going on. More likely it's because this is a strong structure. It's also the simplest shape. We think of things as very square-like in the United States. In St. Louis, where I am, we think of things being box-shaped when we think of houses. But squares are not as strong. Triangles are very strong. Triangles are the simpler and more durable shape. So do we think that they didn't have square-shaped structures? Of course they did. But these were made to last a long time. Mountains don't fall down. They explode sometimes, but mountains don't fall down. This is the shape of a mountain. Mountains don't fall down because this is just like if you take sand and you pour it out on the ground, this is the shape it makes. There's nowhere for it to fall, which makes these long lasting structures. So it could be that there were other monumental structures that just didn't survive. They fell down. Because I think about these brick houses that I see in St. Louis. I live in a brick house. It's about 150 years old. And if I don't constantly care for it, it will fall down. There are so many of these houses that we make out of stone, out of brick. If you just abandon them for 10 years, the roof caves in. And once the roof caves in, the walls fall down. So for something to last thousands of years, it needs to be a stronger structure. And you'll notice these are the three large pyramids, and there's three smaller pyramids here that often aren't in the pictures. And there's a long distance, a lot longer than you think, between the large pyramids in the background and these smaller pyramids in the foreground. These smaller pyramids are the pyramids made for the wives of the pharaohs, of the kings, who the larger pyramids were made for. So there's that weird like reflection between the two structures. And these are tombs. These are burial sites where the kings are buried. Now, it took a long time to make these, and this is something that we'll see when we look at ancient art and when we look at historic art, is that people would spend a long time on something. Like, these took over 100 years to build. So the people who started constructing them are not the same people who finished them. The people that laid the first stones died before the capstone was placed. We can't do that now. There's no way. There's no way I could go to a bank and say, hey, I need a construction loan for a building for my tomb. And they'll be like, okay, what's your time frame? How long is it gonna take you to build? I'm like, okay, well, this is gonna take 120 years to build. And it's gonna be very expensive. The bank would say, no, no, you can't get a loan for something that's gonna take that long. That's not possible. Which is, it's amazing to see these things that exist in their place in time, that we'll never build something like this again. Oh, this is me being a doofus. Yeah. Okay. This is considered the oldest pyramid in Egypt. This is the step pyramid of King Djoser. And this is the first structure that we actually know the name of the person who designed it and built it. His name was Imhotep. And Imhotep was a physician. He practiced medicine and an architect. He designed structures like this one. And he was later deified. After he died, he became part of the Egyptian pantheon. He became part of their religious system. So there's a lot of people in Egypt who were later on named Imhotep. So it's a common name. So this structure, one theory as to how this was built, you can see that it has that kind of stair-step look to it. One theory about this being built was that this was built as a monument for the burial site for King Djoser, and that first platform was built, and the main road is a little bit set down and away from this. And so one theory is that after he built the first layer, you couldn't see it from the road. It wasn't tall enough. So then he built the second layer to make it taller, and then it just came over the horizon, but still it wasn't real noticeable. So then built the third layer to get it up high enough that you could see it. And then by that time, they kind of had this design going and just built it the rest of the way up and ended up with the step pyramid. That's a theory. One of the reasons that it might have been built this way could just be that this was the design that Imhotep came up with. So with these burial sites, you have this vast pantheon religious system that has to do with the afterlife and passing on. This is a papyrus of Hunifer that gives us a good example of what this passage into the afterlife looks like. And this is painted on papyrus. Papyrus is, actually you can see a papyrus in this. This plant right here is papyrus. Papyrus is a grass that grows near water sources, and it grows pretty tall, that you can cut it and it unrolls kind of like a scroll. And it has its own binder in it, its own glue in it, that you unroll it and you put the sheets together, make multiple sheets together, and you turn one so that the fiber is perpendicular to the other, and just smash it. And when you smash it together, when it dries, it comes out as this flat sheet and is useful as a paper-like substance. And we had two different groups of people working on this papyrus. You have the artist that makes the drawings, and then you have the scribe that does all of the writing. And both of those are important. A lot of what we know about funeral rites in Egypt was that the placement of hieroglyphics, the placement of these words in and around the body, were important and necessary for the proper passage of the spirit of the person into the afterlife. So this shows us a little bit about what we're looking at here, what's happening in this papyrus. We have the Set, the soul, on the left, holding hands with Anubis. Anubis has the head of a jackal or a dog. And then as he comes over, Anubis is weighing on scales. You see these scales here. This is a canopic jar, which is a jar that holds the heart. When a person was mummified, certain organs were taken out and they would be put into what's called canopic jars. Those are the organs that on their own they will decay, they will rot, they will smell. They would seal them in jars so that they would be preserved. And it was believed that those canopic jars, the heart especially, was vital to keep it with the body, for the body to be able to be reanimated one day in the future, to come back to life. And there was even beliefs about people wanting to steal the heart of someone after they died. Shapeshifters even coming and trying to replace their own heart with that heart to regain youth. There's a lot of magical practice here. So Anubis is weighing the heart on this scale, and on this side is a feather. He's weighing the heart against the feather, and if the heart weighs more than the feather, then the person is not worthy to pass into the afterlife. But if the feather weighs more, which here the feather does weigh slightly more, then that means the soul is able to move on. Amemet here is part crocodile, the head of a crocodile, the body of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippo. And if the soul is deemed not worthy, then Amemet will eat the soul. They are there to devour the person's essence. If they are, and here we have Thoth. Thoth is the scribe. Thoth is writing down the results of this experiment, and then Horus is taking the soul to Osiris here. Yeah. A lot going on. So I do want to point out, if you look at Thoth here, the shape of the head, this is an ibis. It's a kind of bird, a sacred ibis. So an ibis looks like this. This is a picture that I took when I lived in Rwanda. This is a picture I took in my backyard. These birds would just come hang out on my back fence. They're very, very loud and a little bit obnoxious, but they're beautiful birds to look at. And this is not a sacred ibis. A sacred ibis that you would see commonly in Egypt is white. This is just a more common gray ibis. And these were very useful birds. They were used, it's recorded, a historian named Josephus recorded their use in Egypt, in the desert, that these birds eat snakes and would commonly walk in front of you. So people who would own an ibis and they would have it walk ahead of you when you're walking through the desert or walking through a wilderness area. And if there are any snakes that come out, the ibis will eat the snake before it gets to you. And this long beak that the ibis has is really useful for that. It can stab at the snake and it can grab it without being able to get bitten. Often the snake will bite the beak and not bite the bird until the bird can kill it. Also, Thoth, being an ibis and also being a scribe, the beak of this does look a lot like a pen. It comes to a point like that. It looks like something, a tool that a scribe would use. And then the other god here to look at is Anubis with this head of the jackal. And it looks very similar to this dog here. This was my dog when I lived in Rwanda. We had to get her put down last year. But she looks very, very similar to Anubis. This dog breed is called Canine Africanus. It's one of two dog breeds that are associated with the same jackal, the same dog that Anubis is based off of. And you can see that long snout and those long ears that stick straight up that look very similar to Anubis. All right. So now moving into Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is in southern Egypt, but the Nile flows north, so Upper Egypt is south, and so that can be confusing. But this is a place called Hatshepsut's palace. Hatshepsut was a queen of Egypt. Most of Egyptian history had kings. Hatshepsut is an exception. That her father was King Tutmos. There was some disturbance, and Tutmos the First was not able to assume the throne. He died, and Hatshepsut became the queen. So this is the queen's palace. And at one point there was a river that was diverted that flowed by this palace. The first thing I want to point out is these colonnades. These long rows of columns. We tend to associate columns and rows of columns with Greek and Roman architecture, which we will talk about in the next video, these long rows of columns. But those columns did not exist first in Greece and in Rome. We see these colonnades in Egypt first. We see them also in Persia, which is in Iran, before we start seeing them in Greece. The other thing about this building is how it's set into the stone. We talked about caves before and cave people. One of the reasons that people commonly lived in caves is because not only do caves protect artifacts, caves protect people as well. It's a good shelter. It protects you from the rain, it protects you from the heat, it protects you from the cold. So one of the reasons to build a building into a mountain is because you don't have to go very far underground for it to be cool. See, I'm in my art studio. My art studio is in my basement, and it is a lot colder in my basement than it is on the second floor of my house. So, and I'm what, 6 feet underground? You only have to go maybe 10 feet underground, and it's never going to freeze, and it's never going to be hot. When you go underground, it stays about 55 degrees year round. So this is a way of having natural air conditioning. If it's hot outside, it's the desert. But if this had water that would run by the front of it, by that front ramp, and then being able to just go back into the mountain where it's cool and it's dry and it's comfortable, is the most efficient air conditioning. People do this now. I have a neighbor up the street that paid a lot of money to dig what's called a geothermal well, which is basically digging a hole that goes straight down into the ground, and then pumping air through that hole. The air is pumped down into the earth and then comes back up. So there's no cooling element. It air conditions the house. It make the air just being pumped into the earth and back out. That air comes out cold. That's what this is. Yeah. So it actually makes a lot of sense to use that cave structure for comfort. So after Hatshepsut, we have this king, and I want to talk about him because he's a very unique and interesting figure. This is a man named Akhenaten. His birth name was not Akhenaten. His birth name was Akhenamen, but he had his name changed to Akhenaten. Aten is the sun. He's the person of the sun. And he changed so much about Egypt for one time. It's called the Anarman period. So Akhenaten considered himself to be godlike and changed the entire religious structure of Egypt. And when we're looking at really old cultures and communities, there isn't such a thing as separation of church and state. So there isn't such a thing as a government and a religion being separate from each other. This is a time when a priest is also the judge and the government worker. And so the religious system and the political system are so tied in together that you can't change one without changing the other. Akhenaten took the power away from the priests of Egypt. Egypt had a massive pantheon. Pantheon is a term that means many gods. Pan means many, gods. Theon, Theo, is God. Pantheon, many gods. So Egypt had a massive pantheon, and Akhenaten changed that system, that he got rid of the pantheon, went to a monotheist system, and stated, oh, there's only one God, and it's Aten, that created everything and is the sun. And he got rid of the priest structure. So all of the priests, he's like, the priests, that each priest kind of attended to a different god. It's like, we're going to get rid of that. There's no more priest system, just me. Aten is the only god, and he only talks to me. So I have all the power now. And when you look at Akhenaten and the way he looks, there's something about him that's very unique. You can see that he's somewhat androgynous. He has these wider hips, quite a curvy figure, actually, that's very feminine while being masculine at the same time. He's slightly pregnant. And if you look at his garment, you can see all of these lines radiating out. You can see all of these lines radiating out from right here, kind of giving this like focus on that area, almost this focus on reproduction and creation. And those lines radiating out are representative of the sun. So he is presenting himself as a deity, as a god. He's also presenting himself as both man and woman. And there's something about his head that's weird too. So if we look at some other depictions of Akhenaten, we have here on the left, this is Akhenaten, this is his wife. You can see he still has this little belly pooch that sticks out here. That is an intentional feature. He has all of the lines radiating out from it. It's almost like he's presenting himself as pregnant. And this is his children, and when you look at their heads, there's something about them that are a little different. They're very long. If anyone's ever watched Ancient Aliens, you've probably seen this. That they're like, oh, clearly Akhenaten was an alien, and his children are from an alien race. No, that's not the case. One theory is that he had a very misshapen head, that his head was really long, that he maybe had some, like when he was a child, maybe had hydrocephaly, which is when water gets into your brain cavity and into your skull and inflates the size of your cranium, which often children do not survive that. But it's possible that he could have had some kind of trauma to his skull. Another theory is the possibility of head binding, where the children, and you can kind of see possibly with this child here, that something would be wrapped around the skull to elongate it while the child's head is developing to make them look this way. We don't know. We don't know exactly why his head is like that. But some of the theories are if he did have some kind of head trauma, that he maybe also had some kind of delusions, some kind of schizophrenia, and possibly why he thought he was a god. So we have Aten here, the sun, and the sun has all of these rays coming out. And the sun rays have these little hands on the end, and you can see this one here and these ones here are holding what's called the Ankh, which is a loop with the cross in it, which is like that spirit, the life force from the gods. And giving the Ankh to Akhenaten and to his wife, and who you might recognize as Nefertiti. So this was Akhenaten's wife, Nefertiti. And it's an excellent reproduction of her face. And it's interesting, it's fascinating. I find it fascinating that this is how he is presented. It's almost caricaturized. That this does not read as a direct representation of Akhenaten. But this reads as a direct representation of Nefertiti. And I do want to point out this doesn't have a pupil here. It has one pupil. It does not have the other one. It's missing it. It never had the other pupil. And there are multiple copies of this same sculpture. This is the best example. This is the best one. It's in the best shape. But this one is at a museum in London. Again, it was some English archaeologists that uncovered it, and they brought it back to England. And during the time when these were being excavated, late 1800s, early 1900s, there were so many excavators. There were so many artifacts from Egypt going back to Europe that they were just being sold on the streets in Europe. There's even cases where mummies were brought back to Europe and then ground into a powder and made into paint. It's called mummy brown. It's crazy, the things that were happening with the artifacts from Egypt. And Egypt really would love to get these back. And again, it's an ongoing legal battle. But there is a version of this in the museum in Cairo, in the Egyptian History Museum. It's just not as nice as this one. But this pupil is missing, and it was never there. This is a copy of a copy that was made at the time. So a king or a queen, they had their official portrait that would be made. And the official portrait needs to be used all throughout the country. We have this now. Our president, the president of the United States, always has an official portrait. And whenever there's a new president, that portrait is sent out to every government building in the world. So if you go to an embassy or even a post office, most post offices have the official portrait of the president on the wall. But every embassy in the world, they have the official portrait of the current president. And it's the exact same image in every single one. They did the same thing. This is the official portrait of Nefertiti. So they wanted that same image to be in carvings, in drawings, in sculptures, all throughout Egypt. But Nefertiti isn't going to go into each community, into each village, into each town to have artists look at her and make pictures or carvings. So what she would do, they would have one artist, the official artist of the court, who would make a really good sculpture like this one. Looking at the queen, observing her, spending hours getting it perfect, getting her approval. She would say, yes, this is good. I like the way this looks. This can be how people present me. And then he would make copies. He would make 4 or 5 using that original as the model. Those copies would be sent out to different regions of Egypt. And then there would be different artists in the different regions that would make copies of those copies. They would make them as exact as they can. And those would be sent out to individual artists that they would have a model. They could use this to make their drawings. They could use this to make their sculptures, to make whatever it is that they're making, to represent the image of the queen, so that all of the images of her throughout Egypt would look the same, look exactly like this. It's also amazing how well the pigment in these has been preserved. There, you would expect some amount of fading, that these colors, colors over time don't they don't last forever. Some of these colors, like that blue, is a pretty. It doesn't look like lapis exactly, but it could be. It's kind of dirty. Lapis doesn't fade, so that blue being that strong, it's probably lapis. But a lot of colors will become darker or lighter over time. So it's safe to assume that these colors, especially on her headdress, were very bright, very vibrant, and they look faded. So you can expect that all of the paint on this is also faded. So her skin tone as well, you cannot use this as an exact basis for what her skin looked like, because this pigment now does not look like it did when it was painted. And a lot of people make that mistake. Okay, following up after the Anarman period, after Queen Nefertiti, after King Akhenaten, came this new king named King Tutankhamun, who was actually born with a different name, again, Tutankhaten, and then name changed to Tutankhamun, which also was representative of a shift in government and religion with we call King Tut. With King Tut came the return of the priesthood, the return of polytheism and the pantheon, the return to the former structure. This was a very young king. He did not live very long. He was a teenager when he died. He had a lot of health problems. He had a misshapen spine. He was underweight. So there was a lot of issues with King Tut. It's not exactly known why. It's possible that it could have been due to inbreeding, which has been common in royal families throughout the world, throughout history. For some reason, he had some health problems. But this was his burial sarcophagus, his coffin. And what you see here, the smaller one in the foreground, it's gold and it's inlaid with lapis. That blue is lapis, and it has aquamarine, which is the lighter blue. This coffin would be placed inside the larger golden coffin behind it. There was a lot of different levels of what things would be put in, and then that would be placed inside a stone tomb. And all of his burial riches, all of the gold, all of the furniture, everything that he owned was buried with him. And this tomb never got raided. This is a tomb that didn't get stolen out of. It remained sealed longer than most. There should be a lot more of these kinds of things. But like I said, people were stealing artifacts and taking them to Europe. But this one wasn't found. The seal wasn't broken during all of that raiding. And so this stayed in Egypt. So all of this is still in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And the Egyptian Museum in Cairo is a fascinating place. There are so many artifacts being uncovered and found every day, all the time in Egypt, that they don't have the time and space to even catalog everything. They bring in artifacts into that museum and they go into piles. They have piles of artifacts. And then they have people who are working around the clock to try to catalog and to figure out what to do with them. And reading the hieroglyphics and trying to piece together more of Egypt's history, but there are new artifacts found every day. But they do now have a law that no artifacts can be taken out of Egypt, and any artifact found, you don't get to keep it because you found it. It does not belong to you because you found it. If you find something in Egypt, it belongs to Egypt. It belongs to the Egyptian government, and it goes straight to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. This area of the museum, however, is a different section of the museum. It is temperature controlled, humidity controlled. You have to go through giant bulletproof glass doors to get into this area. It's guarded by men with machine guns, because there's a lot of gold in this area of the museum, and it's all King Tut's burial gold. And this is King Tut's headdress. This is what went directly, so on the mummy, the head would be wrapped in papyrus, the body would be wrapped in cloth and then wrapped in papyrus. The papyrus would all be inscribed. It would all have certain ritualistic writings on them. And then on top of that was this headdress. And this would then go inside the first coffin, which went in the second coffin, which went in the sarcophagus that went in the tomb. A lot of layers going into this, but the craftsmanship on this is incredible. So this is hammered gold. This is not casted. So casted would be if you make something hollow and you pour liquid metal into it. This is not made with liquid metal. This is made by taking sheets of metal and hammering them into this shape. And then to get it smooth, you would take a different kind of hammer, a hammer that was smoother, and smooth out those areas, get all of your hammer marks out, and eventually moving down to sanding and polishing. But also leaving these areas for the stone to be inlaid, cutting the stone to fit exactly in that inlay, and inlaying it in. And the fact that this is all survived and the inlay is still all in there, that only happens because this tomb was not raided. No one has stolen the stones out of this. No one has stolen anything out of this tomb. It's pretty amazing. And thinking about how this was a king that did not reign for very long. This was a king that only reigned for a few years. Thinking about what the burial site would have been for, say, the kings that were buried in the pyramids at Giza, if those tombs hadn't been raided, what was in there? Because a lot of times what happens with things like this is someone goes in, they steal it, they melt the gold down, they cut the stone into jewelry, and they can make more money with it that way. That's it for this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. The next video will be on classical Greek and Roman art, and that transition from what we saw today, mainly with the statues at Tel Asmar, into classical Greek and Roman art. Thank you.